You are listening to The Soul's Quiet Call, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 10, The Garden of Restraint. The morning was cool, the kind of weather that brushed the skin with a gentle touch, offering solace after the heavy humidity of the summer. The sun had barely risen, its first golden rays casting long shadows over the quiet town. Meera stood at the threshold of her flower shop, watching the soft ripples of the sea in the distance. It was early enough that the streets were still mostly empty, the only sounds being the distant calls of seagulls and the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore. The door creaked open behind her, and Meera turned to find Aarav stepping inside, his usual calm demeanor in place, but there was something different in his eyes today, a kind of resolve she hadn't seen before. "Meera," he greeted her, his voice steady but with a hint of something deeper. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to accompany me somewhere today." Meera raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Somewhere?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Where?" "It's a temple," Aarav said, his gaze shifting to the side, as though he were unsure how to explain. "A place I used to visit when I was younger. I haven't been there in years. But something tells me, maybe it's time." The invitation hung in the air, between them. Meera felt a twinge of uncertainty. A temple, a place of peace, of reflection. It sounded like an escape, something Aarav had been seeking for a while, something deeper than their usual conversations. It wasn't like him to ask for company, to seek someone else's presence in his personal moments of solitude. But something about the way he looked at her, the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet invitation, made it impossible to turn him down. "I'd be honored," Meera said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why the words felt so right, but they did. And when Aarav smiled, the faintest curve of his lips, it was as if a weight shifted between them. The temple was nestled at the edge of the town, surrounded by lush greenery and the scent of wet earth. The path leading up to it was lined with stone lanterns, their light flickering softly in the early morning stillness. Meera and Aarav walked side by side, their footsteps in sync with the natural rhythm of the world around them. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, filling the space between them with a sacred quiet. As they approached the temple's entrance, Aarav slowed his pace, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. Meera noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he walked with his head slightly downcast, as though carrying an invisible weight. She had seen him like this before, when he thought she wasn't looking, but today it seemed more pronounced, as though his very soul was wrapped in grief. They stepped into the temple, its large wooden doors creaking softly as they pushed them open. The inside was cool, the air filled with the soft hum of prayer bells, their delicate chimes reverberating through the stone walls. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes of gods and goddesses, their eyes serene and their hands holding symbols of protection and peace. Meera took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. The stillness of the temple was a balm to her restless mind, but she was also keenly aware of Aarav, the distance between them still palpable. He had invited her here, but had yet to speak, his silence growing heavier by the minute. They walked toward a small garden in the back of the temple, a serene space where the fragrance of jasmine and frangipani filled the air. The garden was lush, with stone statues of deities tucked into the corners, their faces weathered by time but still holding an air of quiet grace. Aarav stopped by a stone bench and sat down, his eyes fixed on a small pond in front of him. Meera sat beside him, not speaking immediately. She could feel the weight of his silence, but she didn't know how to breach it. She had always been able to read the hearts of others, to understand their desires, their fears, their unspoken truths. But with Aarav, she had learned that silence could be as telling as words. Finally, Aarav spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I used to come here often, when I was a boy," he said, his eyes still on the pond, his tone distant. "My family and we would visit, especially after the fire." The word struck Meera like a physical blow, though she wasn't sure why. She had always known there was more to Aarav's story, something painful, something he kept buried deep inside. But hearing him speak of it, so casually, as if the wound were still fresh, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. "A fire?" she asked, her voice quiet, though her mind was racing. "What happened?" Aarav didn't look at her, but she could see his jaw tighten. "It was years ago. We were all together, here, in the town. I was young, too young to understand what was happening. My parents, my sister, they were everything to me. And then one night, a fire broke out. It destroyed everything. Our house, everything we knew. My sister, she didn't make it." His voice faltered for a moment, and Meera's heart tightened. She wanted to say something, anything to ease his pain, but the words didn't come. Instead, she sat there, listening, as he continued. "After that, my family changed," he continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "My parents, they never recovered. They became distant, consumed by their own grief. My father, especially. He was never the same after that night. And me?" Aarav chuckled bitterly. "I ran. I left. I thought if I left, I could escape the pain. I could outrun the loss. But there was no place far enough." Aarav's eyes finally turned toward her, and for the first time in their time together, she saw a glimpse of the person he had kept hidden for so long. His eyes were dark, filled with sorrow, regret, and a kind of despair she had never imagined could exist behind his calm exterior. "I've never really come back," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not in the way I should have. And that's why I keep running. I've been running from my family, from the memories, from the guilt of leaving them behind. But I don't know how much longer I can keep running, Meera." Her heart ached for him, and for the first time, she understood the depth of his silence. It wasn't just a shield, it was a fortress he had built around himself to protect against the hurt, the guilt, the grief. She didn't know how to reach him, how to break through the walls he had constructed, but she knew that she couldn't just stand by and watch him carry this burden alone. "Aarav," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know what it's like to lose someone like that. But I know that running doesn't heal the wounds. And you don't have to do it alone. If you'll let me, I'll help you carry it." Aarav's gaze softened, but there was still a hesitation, a resistance. "You don't understand," he said, his voice raw. "You don't know what it's like to carry guilt like this." "Maybe not," Meera said gently, her hand moving toward his, her fingers brushing against his skin in an unspoken gesture of solidarity. "But I understand loneliness, Aarav. I understand what it's like to feel like no one truly sees you. And I see you. All of you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the words hanging between them, heavy with meaning. Aarav's gaze met hers, and in his eyes, Meera saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected, hope, maybe. A glimmer of something he had long ago buried. "I'm afraid," Aarav admitted quietly. "Afraid of what happens if I let someone in again. Afraid of being hurt, of losing more than I already have." Meera's heart broke for him, but she didn't look away. "We all have our fears, Aarav. But sometimes, you have to take the risk. Let someone in. Let yourself heal." He was silent for a long while, and just as Meera thought he might pull away again, he turned to her, his eyes softening. Maybe it's time," he said, his voice almost a whisper. In that moment, something shifted between them, something that hadn't been there before. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And Meera felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, they were both starting to heal. As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the quiet serenity of the temple, Meera realized that their connection wasn't just about what she could see in his eyes, it was about what they were willing to share, what they were willing to give to each other. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were both ready to open up, to trust, and to find peace together. But it was only the beginning. And the path ahead was still uncertain.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Refer to the channel playlist for a better experience and close your eyes to let your imagination run wild. Subscribe.